Well, thank you so much for being here at our inaugural Modern Money Lab UK Anti-Austerity Conference. It is amazing to see so many of you. And we're here because, okay, clap, thank you. So we are here because we have been lied to. From the 80s, when Thatcher told us there was no such thing as public money, to the last 15 years of austerity imposed on us because, again, there's no money, allegedly, for the government to spend. And we're told that we have to seek growth in our economy through private investment to make ourselves attractive to the likes of Blackstone and big tech. Our local councils have seen their budgets decimated, so they're forced to sell off key assets like leisure centres, allotments, and youth centres, drawing down on our public wealth. And so the mission of Modern Money Lab UK is to give you and everyone in the UK the tools to fight back against these lies, to challenge the politicians and members of the 1% who want you to believe there is no alternative, to show you that the crises that we face, from inequality to the housing crisis through to the climate crisis, can all be traced back to how we have been forced to live in an economy in service of the elites and not the 99%. So this is the first step towards taking truly democratic control over our money, and as a result, over who our economy serves and how. So thank you for being here, and I can't wait to hear about everything you'll learn today. I can't wait to hear what you think about everything you'll learn today. Thank you. So our first speaker tonight, Stephen, is a powerhouse of alternative economics, a mentor to many in this room. He learned the same traditional economics that many of our politicians did, having actually studied the same masters as Rachel Reeves at LSE, but in his career trained central bankers who first alerted him to the fact that it didn't actually work the way that the textbooks say. And he's a rare example of an economist able to truly question what they've learned and break out of these incorrect paradigms. He, along with Gabby Bond, who's sitting there monitoring the online chat, and hello to the online chat. We really want to make sure that you have as much of a good experience as all the folks in this room. Gabby's going to be monitoring your questions. Do get involved. They run an online master's program at Torrens University in Adelaide, the Economics of Sustainability. It's the only place in the world where you can study ecological economics with a true understanding of how governments spend money. And this form of economics is an essential piece to provide a feasible pathway towards an economy where everyone can thrive without destroying the planet. And I and many other MML volunteers, MML UK volunteers, are students on this master's program, so do come talk to us if you're interested. So Stephen is going to talk more about the specifics around why austerity is a political choice here in the UK, and then he'll transition over to Stephanie later. Bear with us on the transitions. We got some complicated tech stuff, but hopefully it'll go well. But give Stephen a big round of applause.
Okay, now here's where I show my technological limitations, but we'll see how we go. Oh, okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Gabby and I have come from from the other side of the world to be here. It's wonderful to see so many people, and we are so proud of our students, Sheridan very much included, for organising this event. Gabby and I did not organise this event, but we're delighted to be here. And I'm just going to talk for a few minutes before handing over to one of the adjunct professors on our programme, Stephanie Kelton, who of course many of us saw in the movie Finding the Money earlier on, who is a great friend of ours and in many ways our inspiration in the first 3 years of the programme. So it'll be wonderful to have her join us. Sheridan talked about austerity as a political choice, and she talked about the last 15 years. Well, I'm a bit older than Sheridan. I'm a bit older than Rachel Reeves as well, actually. So I can remember when I was at school 45 years ago, we've had at least 45 years, arguably more than that, of public policy based on widely believed myths and misunderstandings about the money system, which were rehearsed, investigated in the movie Finding the Money. The main thing that most people that you meet the great majority of politicians, virtually all the politicians I've ever met, and many economists misunderstand about the monetary system here in Australia and in any country where the government issues its own national currency is the vital distinction between currency users and currency issuers. You and I are currency users, businesses, not-for-profits, local authorities. They're currency users. They have to go and get pounds before they can spend them. They either have to earn the pounds or they can borrow the pounds now. But if they borrow pounds now, of course, they build up a debt. Over time, you can get into financial distress. You can potentially be ruined and end up bankrupt if you are a currency user. If you are a currency issuer, and as we're going to say in a couple of minutes, if you weren't aware of this already, the UK government is the currency issuer of the British pound, then you're in a completely different position. And arguably, as long as you don't borrow in foreign currency, in a currency that you don't issue yourself, I mean, you can talk about government borrowing, you can talk about the government's debt or the national debt, but the government doesn't have a debt in the meaningful sense of the term at all. Now, if this had been widely understood over the last 45 years, particularly by progressives, then we might have been more effective in arguing against some of the things you can see on the screen at the moment. We could have avoided the huge jump in inequality that's happened in this country. In the mid-1970s, Britain had a Scandinavian level of inequality. Some of the Scandinavian countries still have Scandinavian levels of inequality. There was a massive jump in inequality during the Thatcher years in this country, and it has never been significantly reversed since. We could have avoided decades of underfunded public services. We could have avoided building an economy based on a massive expansion of household debt. We could have avoided the worst features of the housing crisis. We could have avoided a whole series of inappropriate, disastrous privatizations. We could have avoided building an economy where people live in insecurity and underemployment or unemployment or fear of unemployment. We could have avoided an economy based on casino capitalism. Rachel Reeves and all her predecessors, when I started studying economics, the relevant one was, some of you might be old enough to remember the name, Sir Geoffrey Howe. All her predecessors in between have unnecessarily chosen harsh public austerity while misrepresenting the alternatives. I'm not going to go into the reasons for that now. In some cases, it was in their interest to do so. In other cases, they genuinely didn't or don't understand. It's time to think differently about what it means to be a currency issuer, and it's time to think differently about what it means for the UK government to frame a responsible budget. You've had the Charter for Budget Responsibility since 2011, but as I said, this narrative goes back far beyond that. Here are some quotes which are easy to find on the net from various Chancellors of the Exchequer down the years. Gordon Brown in 2001, we will meet our first fiscal rule. We will balance the current budget. That's one of Rachel Reeves's rules now, to try to do that at the end of the 2020s. Gordon Brown was saying the same thing in 2001. It didn't lead to stability there. It contributed towards the development of the global financial crisis. We see Rachel Reeves. We are still very reliant on the goodwill of strangers in buying our government bonds. Now, I haven't put it on this slide, but there's a very similar quote from 1979 from Sir Geoffrey Howe. It wasn't true then. It's not true now. Even the auctioning of government bonds, treasury bonds, gilts, in the first place is a choice. It's not a necessity. The interest rates on government bonds are determined, I won't go into the details now, but by expected future Bank of England policy, expected future monetary policy. The Bank of England sets the interest rate, whether people realise that or not. Then you've got that quote from Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. It's almost word for word the same as what Margaret Thatcher said in 1987. The government is not some entity which has its own money. The government only has money because people pay taxes. One of the great, of course, messages of that movie, Finding the Money, is that this is completely 180-degree wrong. George Osborne, the last government spent a decade putting everything on the national credit card. Actually, they spent some of that decade running fiscal surpluses, very unwise fiscal surpluses, the Blair-Brown government. And now we're having to cut up the cards and start living within our means. Nonsense. But I heard this nonsense on the news this morning in this country. I heard someone from the Labour Party saying that the economy was slowing down, unemployment would rise, so it would be difficult for Rachel Reeves to achieve her fiscal rules, so you'd have to have cuts in public spending or higher taxes or both. This is nonsensical, of course. If there is a recession, if you do have more unemployed resources, that's the time for the currency issuer to spend more, not to spend less. That's the time when real resources are available, which can be put to use, improving people's well-being, transitioning towards a sustainable post-growth economy. And you all remember David Cameron talking about there being no magic money tree. Of course, we know by now it's easier than that. The money side of things is the easy side. It comes out of a computer keyboard. It's no more. Some facts, simple facts about public finance. Now, there is a paper which was previously published in draft form on the website of the Gower Institute of Modern Money Studies and also on a website at University College London, which is in the Journal of Economic Issues this year, which goes through in intricate detail the institutional aspects of how the national government spends and taxes in the UK, the self-financing state paper. But let's have a look at a cartoon instead, which basically says the same thing and expresses how your monetary system, our monetary system works. Every pound that the UK government spends is a new pound. The government spends through currency issuance. The UK government sits at the top of the monetary system. As it spends pounds, it spends those pounds, of course, into private sector bank accounts, PS for private sector there. Whether we are talking about the spending which supports the economy, provides your economic and social infrastructure, supports profitable businesses as well, for that matter, or whether we're talking about the payment of interest to people who have purchased gilts, treasury bonds in the past. Every pound is a new pound. What do taxes do at the macroeconomic level? They limit the ability of the private sector to spend, to create room within the productive capacity of the economy, to allow the government to spend and to make investments without it being inflationary, without contributing towards inflation risk. But they don't fund the government's spending. And indeed, just as it said in the movie, the government has to spend pounds into the system before those pounds are available to pay national taxes, or for that matter, to buy newly auctioned treasury bonds or gilts. What are treasury bonds? They're just interest-bearing savings accounts, transferable savings accounts at the Bank of England. That's all they are. They play functions within your financial system. They provide safe assets to fund managers. The interest rates, or yields as they're called, on gilts provide benchmark default risk-free interest rates, which define what we call the term structure of interest rates in the UK. And they drain pounds from bank reserve accounts at the Bank of England and from private sector bank accounts. But just as taxes do not literally pay for government spending, so treasury bonds don't pay for government spending either. The issuance of treasury bonds in the first place, the full funding rule, is a 45-year-old political choice. It's not a necessity. The government is not dependent on the bond market. The UK government needs neither rich people's taxes nor bond sales to be able to buy anything which is for sale in return for pounds. I'm not saying don't tax rich people more highly. I am saying that's not going to pay for anything, literally, not the way the UK monetary system works. So tax richer people in order to impact the distribution of income and wealth, but don't pretend it's paying for public services, because it isn't. It's not even significantly always reducing inflationary pressures in the economy, because when rich people pay more taxes, generally it comes out of their savings and not out of what they'd be spending in the economy. Neither taxes nor bond sales fund spending. They have other functions I was just talking about. The government can buy anything which is for sale in pounds. How can you guarantee there'll be a demand for pounds in the private sector? Just as it said in the movie, there'll always be a demand for pounds while the currency is that which is necessary to pay UK taxes, while tax liabilities are valued in pounds and while you have to pay your taxes in pounds. Austerity has been a political choice all along. And it's led to self-inflicted pain. You had that hoo-ha with those disastrous, disgraceful planned cuts in welfare spending last year in this country that we were following the news from Australia. And I could have picked umpteen articles from the BBC News site or a variety of newspapers that would have said the sorts of things you can see on the screen here. A couple of weeks ago, there was an article which said UK borrowing costs hit 27-year high, adding to pressure on Rees. Well, while the Bank of England is not intervening directly in the bond market to set interest rates, which it could do, interest rates on the bond market depend, as I mentioned before, on expected monetary policy decisions by the Bank of England during the period of time when the bonds are issued. So if interest rates have increased on the bond market, that just means that traders on the bond market are betting that the Bank of England is going to increase the bank rate, or it's more likely the Bank of England will increase the bank rate in the next few months or over the next few years relative to what was the case before. As it happens, the increase in interest rates was reversed a couple of days later, but you didn't get such big headlines when that happened. When she became Chancellor, as you know, Reeves set out 2 rules on government borrowing, which he has repeatedly said are non-negotiable, just as the Prime Minister has. Day-to-day government costs will be paid for by tax income rather than borrowing, if we're going to call it borrowing at all, by 2029-30. Well, that was Gordon Brown's rule in 2001. It didn't work that well then. To get debt, the net financial liabilities of the government falling as a share of national income by the end of this Parliament. Well, why do you want to do that? The net financial liabilities of the UK government are the net financial assets of everybody else, the UK private sector, but also the rest of the world, when the rest of the world wants to hold more pounds than before. There's no reason for having these rules in place. The government is the currency issuer. It's not a currency user. It's not going to be faced with a crisis which is related in some way to bankruptcy risk. The UK government, given your current monetary system, can't go bust. I think most of you know that already. And what does this all lead to? Well, it can lead to disappointments as far as the present government and the Chancellor of the Exchequer is concerned, of course. But it has devastating consequences in the long run, because we have had this narrative here since I was at school. Government after government, both sides of politics. We spent 45 years, as I said at the beginning, underfunding public services, privatising, financialising, deregulating the financial system, and trying to support the economy based, because the government didn't want to do enough deficit spending, on households doing it, on growing household debt. And that too has been linked to a bubble on the property market, unaffordable housing. We know where this leads to in the end. We know what the consequences are of tolerating much higher levels of inequality and economic insecurity over a long period of time. In the US, it led to Donald Trump. In the UK, it will inevitably lead to a reform UK government unless we challenge this vigorously and repeatedly now while there's still time. Fiscal deficits are normal and will remain so. Just as they said in the movie, surpluses and deficits have to cancel out across the monetary system. A nice, easy way of remembering that: for every net lender on the monetary system, there has to be a net borrower. The pluses and minuses have to cancel out. We often talk of three sectors: a government sector, a private sector, and a foreign sector. In the UK, for most of the last 45 years, the foreign sector has wanted to be in net surplus. In other words, the foreign sector has wanted to hold more and more pounds. As the years have gone by, the pound remains the fifth most widely traded currency on the global foreign exchange market. That's not likely to end anytime soon. The private sector should, in a healthy monetary system, be in surplus almost all the time, be net saving to have healthy balance sheets. So if the foreign sector wants to be in surplus and the private sector needs to be in surplus, then the government should be in deficit almost all the time, if not all the time, in a monetary system like the UK monetary system. If the other sectors refuse to run deficits, the government will have to run a deficit. You can try to run a surplus or balance your budget, but if the economy implodes and unemployment increases, you'll end up with a deficit anyway. But it won't be a good deficit supporting your aims and objectives. It'll be the consequence of having mismanaged the economy. You can choose austerity, but you still won't get that surplus that you didn't need to have in the first place. A couple of sectoral balances charts. The IMF classifies about 40 economies as what it calls advanced economies, and because we're looking at 40 economies, then trade surpluses and trade deficits average out to about zero across them all, of course, and it makes the relationship between private sector balance sheets and the government's balance sheet more obvious than is the case when you look at individual countries. The black bars relate to the private sector's financial balance. When the private sector has a positive financial balance, it means private sector net saving is taking place. It means the private sector's balance sheet overall is becoming more secure. You are less likely to be moving towards a more fragile financial system. Now, when we look at all the rich countries around the world, what can you see is true? Every single year, and I could have gone back beyond 1990, for the average rich country in the world, what is the normal state of affairs for the private sector? Deficit or surplus? If the private sector is going to be in surplus, net saving domestic currency, where is that currency coming from? Somebody has got to be in deficit. Who will have to run the deficit? The government. This is normal. Government deficits are nothing to be scared of. Historically, they are the normal case. And if the government does not run deficits, then in the average country, the private sector cannot be in surplus. Your surplus is their deficit. All right, let's move on to the UK. The UK has mismanaged sectoral balances. Let's look at the private sector in the UK. What can we see? We can see at the end of the 1980s, the private sector was in deficit. Actually, the government was in surplus. The government surplus was funded by a private deficit. Households borrowing money to put it into the property market supported the economy and allowed the government to run a pointless surplus just before, of course, there was that big recession in the early 90s. What can we see at the end of the 1990s? We can see again the government manages to be in surplus. The private sector is driven into deficit. Did that create the circumstances for a stable, sustainable financial system. No, it was part of the run-up with all the financial deregulation that allowed it to happen, allowed that build-up in private debt to happen. It was part of the run-up to the global financial crisis. I can't advance the screen though at the moment. Okay, I'm more worried about the screen than I might, but yeah. Okay, well, we've seen that. Now that's the wrong way to try and run your fiscal policy. What we have here historically is we have British governments that even when they're running deficits are trying not to. They're trying desperately to run a surplus. They think that if they have a surplus now, they'll be saving up their currency somehow. This is not the way the monetary system works. It's nonsensical in order to be able to deal with a downturn later on. Actually, it's the government trying to run the surplus, leading to a mix of fiscal and monetary policies, which causes growing private sector debt and especially growing household debt, that creates a fragile financial system, that makes a crisis more likely to happen, and meantime builds inequality. So what can we see here? We can see two big jumps in household debt in the UK. When did the first of them happen? In the 1980s. What was happening there? The Thatcher government was trying to move towards a surplus, was deregulating finance, encouraging a build-up in household debt to support the economy. And the UK went from a country with a very low level of household debt to a country with historically a relatively high level of household debt. And then, believe it or not, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did the same thing again. Trying to drive towards a surplus. Of course you have to deregulate finance. Of course you have to tolerate or even encourage a build-up in household debt. Meantime, the fiscal austerity is doing all the bad things we said it was doing before. And it means that the country, across decades, has lost opportunities to make the sorts of investments in public services and public infrastructure which should have been made, which would have created a very different economy today. While there is no US-style debt ceiling in this country, an inappropriate promise to reduce the non-government net financial assets, that's what she means when she's talking about reducing government debt to GDP. She's reducing everybody else's financial assets. She's draining pounds from the system. It's been used to justify tough choices. The Prime Minister loves to sound tough about fiscal policy, as though there was no alternative. The government has made a pointless and destructive cross for its own back. The rules at the top of the screen on the right-hand side, we shouldn't be following. We shouldn't have those kinds of fiscal targets. They are unnecessary, pointless, and destructive. Instead, what we should be trying to do is to run the economy in order to achieve the objectives of a progressive government based on the available real productive resources within the economy. And as we do that, as we run the economy at non-inflationary full employment, the fiscal deficit should be, well, it should be at whatever net savings in pounds the private sector and the rest of the world wants to make over time. And that's why you need effective counter-cyclical stabilizers to ensure that this is the case, like a job guarantee program. Government spending plans in a mission economy. I think a future progressive government should draw on the ideas of not just the women up on this slide at the moment, but certainly the women up in this slide. The Mission Economy book by Mariana Mazzucato, Donut Economics by Kate Raworth, and especially Stephanie's book, The Deficit Myth. Identify what you want to achieve. Have a meaningful vision for the future economy that you want to create. Audit your real resources and your institutional capacities to identify the extent to which and how quickly you can achieve this vision. Assess whether and to what extent spending plans may contribute to inflation risk. As it says here, plans may need to be deferred or scaled back, just like it says in the movie. Real resources may need to be created or released. If you want to improve healthcare provision, you need skilled people to do it. If you don't have those skilled people, they need to be educated and trained, and it will take time. There will normally be a fiscal deficit, just as there always has been in this country in the past. And that's nothing to be scared about. It just means the government spent more pounds into your monetary system than it's deleted from the system in taxation. This should not be constrained by arbitrary fiscal rules. Anything we can do, anything you can do as a country, we can pay for. Rejecting public austerity is a political choice that we should be making. But I'm not the right person to talk about this. Stephanie Kelton, who we saw in the movie, professor of economics at Stony Brook University, advisor on 2 presidential campaigns for Bernie Sanders, former chief economist on the US Senate Budget Committee, is the right person to talk about this. Her next book has the working title of The Inflation Myth, and I think it will be as influential as was the deficit myth when it came out, and I hope you'll all read it. There is no one better than Stephanie to discuss the economics of provisioning for a green, or let's say a greener, New Deal. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the very nice introduction and for the invitation to join you. I'm obviously delighted to see Modern Money Lab, Stephen and Gabby, and all of the others who work so very hard to put events like this together. I know that you know what a big undertaking it is and how tirelessly they work. So don't forget to tip your waiter at the end of this day and to show them as much appreciation as I feel for them when this is all over. I love that Stephen shared the photo of me and Mariana and Kate. I think that Mariana wants us to establish bold missions, and Kate wants us to be mindful of ecological constraints, to practice donut economics. And I want to make sure that nothing gets in the way of those 2 ladies and their ambitions for the purpose of trying to manage our finances and somehow worry about the impact on the deficit or the debt, wring our hands about where we're going to find the money to pursue the kind of bold missions that Mariana is talking about, and also to incorporate into the MMT framework the kinds of constraints that Kate worries very much about. And so you are obviously the perfect audience, because in many ways, what you are doing at the Modern Money Lab isn't being done anywhere else in the world. That is integrating the MMT lens with the ecological side of things. So I'm going to jump right in. I've got, 30 or so slides, and I'll apologize in advance. It does sort of lean into the US, but of course it is applicable for the UK as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So here we go. All right, the title. I want to assert up front, and I hope that most of you already agree with the proposition that finding the money isn't the challenge we face. We've got all sorts of problems that need to be dealt with. I wrote a chapter in my book, The Deficit Myth, called The Deficits That Matter. And I was pointing out many of the very real deficits that exist all across the economy and society and the world. Those are the things we have to focus on. Finding the money is actually the easy part. And I think many of you have seen the film, and so you at least know what the arguments are. So what I want to do is start by encouraging all of us to break, if we haven't already done so, break that mental trap that I used to fall into, that so many elected officials fall into, journalists, pundits, everyday people, starting with the wrong question. How will you pay for it? Where will the money come from? I want to break that frame and get us all thinking like this little beaver, because boy, does he have it figured out. Okay, what does the beaver do? Does he worry about how he's going to finance the construction of his dam? Does he say, oh, I'm going to have to go down to the riverbank? That's the joke. And take out a loan in order to build a nice habitat for my family. Of course, he doesn't have to do that. The beaver is singularly focused on the mission, right? I want a habitable environment, I want a safe place. I don't want predators to easily be able to find me and get to me. I want to be able to, be sort of protected from the elements, the weather, and so forth. So I got to construct this dam. Now I don't have to worry about permitting and zoning laws and who owns the property and all this sort of stuff. I just need to find me a tree, fell the tree, and get to work. Okay, so the beaver is already sort of hardwired to think like I think we all need to be thinking, which is missions and real resources. Okay, what is the objective and can we do it? So if you haven't seen this, this is a still image, obviously, but I took it from a video that probably came out 8 years ago, something like that. This is a video, it's like a, 11, 14-minute long video. And I think it was produced by the folks over at The Intercept. It was voiced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This is after she was elected to Congress for the first time, so newly elected member. She came in and boy, did she have vision, right? She could see the mission. And she worked with illustrators and, script writer and so forth. And they put together, I think, a really powerful statement to try to get people behind the idea that the challenges that we are facing with respect to climate change, but not only that, seem insurmountable. They're so big. But what she wanted to do and what this video is about saying, but imagine the world as it could be if we really tackled the problems that we face and we didn't let things stand in our way and we doubled down and committed to doing this. What could the world look like? What could we create together? And so if you haven't seen the video, I would encourage you to just use the YouTube machine later on and give it a watch, because it is, I think, really powerful and pretty inspiring. And what they laid out in that video was the sort of promise of a Green New Deal. The language probably familiar to a lot of you, the taken from the New Deal from the era of the 1930s when FDR, Roosevelt was president. The US and other countries around the world, including, of course, where you are, were in the grips of the Great Depression. And it was time for new ideas and for bold thinking. And FDR started up a whole host of programs, introduced things like the minimum wage and Social Security and an alphabet soup of jobs programs, the WPA, the CCC, like all of these different ways to start re-employing people to try to, pull the country out of the depths of the Great Depression. And so what she's doing is applying that kind of familiar history to the challenges of the present and into the future. And she's saying, well, what if we did something like that again on a grand scale, but we organize the programs so that in one way or another, we are caring for the planet, caring for our communities, and caring for people? What if we could do it in a way that, unlike the New Deal, which had problems and was not inclusive, what if this time we tried to really get it right? We didn't leave anybody behind. And so she says, they say in that video, if we're going to do this thing, we have to act boldly and we have to change everything. And then here they're talking about the way we live, so housing, the way we move around, transportation, the way we eat, agriculture, and the way we generate and transmit electricity, so energy on that front, right? But what she didn't say, what they don't say in that video, is that we also have to change the way we think about things like money and taxes, deficits and debt and inflation. And you can add here the real limits and the planetary boundaries, how we think about all of those things. And she knew that this wasn't going to be easy. She knew that there would be not just naysayers and skeptics, but outright hostile opponents, and that those opponents would be well-funded and that they would make use of that vast network of think tanks and influencers and all the media and everything else to try to sow the seeds of doubt and to prevent the public from buying in to this vision. And so she said, we know that we have to save the planet and we know that we have the technology to do it, but people will be scared. You'll hear people say it's too big, it's not practical, they want to go too fast, and they're going to use all of their networks to try to create doubt and division. And who is more useful in a moment like that? Well, the economists, of course, the most durably reliable skeptics for something like this. They will be the first to enter the room, wagging fingers, tisking the big, bold ideas, shaming anybody who dares to color too far outside the mainstream, the boundaries of mainstream thinking and so forth. So they roll out people like this guy. This is an economist. He was the head of the Congressional Budget Office. You have your sort of counterpart to that over there in the form of the IFS, right? And he goes out and immediately starts saying, this is ludicrous, what AOC and others are talking about. It would cost $93 trillion, what they want to do. And so, you know, you start bringing up numbers like that. I mean, not just eye-popping, but like, you know, your head explodes. And people immediately start to write it off as unserious. And then a group of economists come in, and I'm just giving you a small sample, okay? The guy on the very bottom here, that's Larry Summers. He was Treasury Secretary under one Barack Obama, so a Democrat, right? He was also president of Harvard University, and someone who just gets an awful lot of media attention and has quite a bit of influence over the policy and political discourse. And then in the middle there, a blogger who says, you know, if we were to do this Green New Deal thing, it would spend the US into oblivion. And people from Heritage Foundation, Cato, other sort of conservative think tanks just calling it fiscally catastrophic. Every headline. I mean, you heard candidates like here, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Sanders had his own proposal for a Green New Deal, the most ambitious of any candidate. It included things like a federal job guarantee, Medicare for all. I mean, all kinds of stuff was put into this, a sort of, you know, who's who or what's what of progressive wish list kind of thing. And that was estimated at $16 trillion cost. So wherever these candidates went, they were dogged by reporters and pundits and so forth with this question, how are you going to pay for it? Where in the world are you going to get trillions and trillions of dollars to underwrite this expensive program that you have in mind? So I modified this. This is not part of the original video, so I took some liberties here. But what AOC said is you can't have what you can't see. And what I'm arguing is you also can't have what you don't think you can afford. So we better get beyond that hurdle or we're not going to get anywhere. So Republicans tweeting out, you know, this is back in the day when we were really debating a Green New Deal. Senator Sanders and another Democrat senator and AOC are out there telling everybody we need a Green New Deal. It's an extreme proposal, you know, it's unworkable, it's not popular, and we can't afford it. So they're playing on a phenomenon that we might call meganumophobia, okay? It's the fear of big numbers. So you throw a big number like 93 trillion out there and it detonates, right? It just blows up the entire policy debate because everyone gets focused on that big number. And then the whole discourse revolves around the money, the budgetary impacts, whose taxes are going to go up, where are you going to find 93 trillion? We don't even, it's 3 times the size, 4 times the size of the US economy almost. So it derails the entire thing. People like this Republican senator use a number like that to say, we're talking about spending more money than we've ever spent in the history of the nation going back to the very beginning. Okay, so we don't want to have that debate. We don't want the conversation to be about the money piece. That's the easy part. We got to wrestle with the hard stuff. So MMT is, I think, useful in first that it can easily handle and counter the how are you going to pay for it question. Okay, those of you who saw the Finding the Money film heard my former colleague and friend Randy Ray say in the film, he says, governments don't find the money, they create it. Okay, they create it in the act of spending. And Stephen, I'm sure if he hasn't already gone through all that, that'll come up over the course of the next day or whatever. So MMT helps us deal with that how are you going to pay for it question by reminding us the federal government's budget doesn't work like a household budget, okay? They don't use the currency, they issue it. This is true for the US, it is true for the UK. Here it's Congress, there it's Parliament. If the government authorizes and commits to the spending will happen. The money will be there. In our case, it's the Federal Reserve who credits bank accounts, creating all of the money that is needed to make good on the spending that has been authorized by elected members of government, right? Parliament or Congress. Central banks make the payments, and what matters is whether that spending will push inflationary pressures beyond some desired level, right? Not finding the money, but managing the spending of that money so that you don't trigger unwanted inflationary problems. We just lived through a period of years where inflation ran hot, and I think we can all agree that people don't like it. Politicians pay a price, and ordinary people don't like it when prices are increasing, especially when they're increasing quite a bit faster than their incomes. So you want to be mindful of inflationary pressures. Okay, have we ever had to do this before? Yes, this is from the video, and this is one of the things AOC wanted to remind us. We've been here before. We know how to do this. We know how to mobilize real resources in short order, like gearing up for World War II was not something that most countries had to, sat back and thought for many years and carefully planned. It came on pretty quickly. And when the US entered World War II, it had put some thought into what it might have to do. And of course, we'd had the experience of World War I, but we also had the benefit of being able to learn from this guy, John Maynard Keynes, right? A British economist who wrote this. I mean, I almost hesitate to call it a book. It's more like a pamphlet in some ways, but this little book, and he called it How to Pay for the War. And if you're just looking at the title, you would think, oh, this is where Keynes, lays out all the different places the money is going to come from to execute the war effort. And it's not that at all, right? This is Keynes's way of saying, okay, if you're mobilizing a nation and all of a sudden the government is going to come in and it's going to need to spend a lot of money and it's going to need to take a lot of real productive capacity that is being used to manufacture everything from textiles to automobiles and household goods and the like, and convert those factories into factories that are now producing, not men's dress shoes and ladies' clothing, but boots and military uniforms, and not producing cars, but producing tanks and munitions and the rest of it. So Keynes says, we better think about how we're going to roll out all of this spending in a way that isn't excessively inflationary. What can we do to curb the inflationary pressures along the way? That's what we learn from reading this little book. And I argued many years ago that we ought to go back and revisit what Keynes said and think. It's like thinking like the beaver. Keynes was an early beaver. Think about the ways that we can do this without causing inflationary problems. So what did Keynes understand? He understood that the real resources are what matters. You have the people, then you have the fighters that you need. We brought women into the workforce in huge numbers during that time to replace workers and allow the production of, a number of these things I was just talking about to happen while many of the men were going off to fight. How do you do this without causing inflation? That's the name of the game. Okay. And I should add, Keynes also did think about how to do it in a way that was just. And that is a very important theme that runs through the AOC video as well. So when he was talking about things like the war bonds, he wanted to make sure that those fell into the hands of the people who are making the greatest sacrifice. You were telling people, we want you to consume less today because we're going to have a full employment economy and then some. There's going to be a lot of money in your hands, but we don't want you using that money to try to spend on consumer goods at a time when the government is trying to spend for the war effort. So we want to encourage you to postpone a lot of that consumption spending, hold bonds instead. The benefit to you will be the interest that you earn. And after we win the war, you can unleash that spending into an economy that is turning back toward the production of consumption goods. So anyway, this is just to remind folks that the US was sitting over here, Britain was already in the war, the US wasn't, but we were paying attention to what Keynes had written. This is a memo written by from the US Treasury saying, look, this guy Keynes seems to really have this figured out. He says if we get this wrong, we're going to end up with inflation. And he's also talking about distributional implications. So the just piece, right? Executing the war effort in a way that the people making the greatest sacrifices would benefit when the war was over. And that was important to Keynes and to AOC. So this is just a little side by side. This is what happened to inflation in the US and in the UK from about 1939 through up until basically 1950. You can see that inflation got pretty high, right? But it didn't get explosive in the sense that you went to hyperinflation or anything like that. And in part, I think it's a pretty good testament. Look, you take an economy where the government is using 15%, taking 15% of total output before the war, and then all of a sudden almost half of it is going to government. That's a massive shift. And to be able to do that without creating persistent inflation that is, ever rising is a testament to, I think, what it's possible to do when you are really determined. And in the US case, of course, we had John Kenneth Galbraith, one of the most important economists of the 20th century, running the Office of Price Administration. And so, nothing was off the table. It's war, right? So rationing and price controls and all the rest of it. But it worked. So how would we do it today? How's my time? I'm peaking. I'm okay. How would we do this, something like this today? Well, you have to start with your resource needs. Well, really you start with the mission, right? What is it we're trying to accomplish? And that needs to be really well specified, right? Clearly defined mission with resource needs. What is it we want to achieve on what time scale, right? Or is this a 10-year program? Is it a 15-year? Is it a 5-year? How fast do we want to go? How much are we trying to wrap our arms around? Are we going for the full Senator Sanders type of transformational program which includes healthcare and education and childcare and infrastructure and climate and all the rest? Or are we more narrowly focused, at least initially, on things that are more directly related to climate needs, infrastructure, maybe housing, and the like? Not my call to make. It's a policy decision, but you need to very clearly define where it is you want to go and then back your way in. Okay, what are the resources it's going to take to achieve those outcomes at the time intervals that we have specified? How many people do we need? What kind of technology will we need? Is it available, right? What about physical capital, machines and the like? Do we have that? Raw materials, do we have those things? So assess your resource needs and figure out what you have. How much of it is available to us today, and then manage the inflationary pressures as you begin to roll the program out. Here's what normally happens. This is normally how resource needs are assessed. You get these various estimates. What would it cost to do a Green New Deal? And you can see these are different, some think tanks, Washington DC think tanks and Forbes. Different people sit down and put pen to paper and they say, okay, if we were going to do a Green New Deal, what would it take? And they write dollars down, right? In order to get 100% renewable energy grid, we need $200 billion. In order to get net zero greenhouse emissions, we need $540 billion. In order to deal with public transportation, $21 billion. Dollars. Well, Congress or Parliament could commit the funding, the dollars, the easy part. Where is the real resource assessment? It isn't here in any of these. So we're not budgeting our real resources. We're stuck in this, if we could write down how many dollars it will take, then somehow spending those dollars automatically manifests into solutions. It doesn't work like that. We talk about assessing our resource capacity. I mean, you can look at stuff like this. You say, how many people are unemployed? You can count bodies, what is the latest estimate for the number of people who say they want a job and don't have one? And you can say, well, we have 7.5 million people or 10 million people or whatever the case may be. But are they 10 million or 7 million unemployed people with the skills and the know-how to translate into the jobs, right? To do the actual work that you want done? If it's high-tech work in solar, wind, I mean, it takes certain skills to do certain things, right? Some things you can reasonably quickly train people to do, but it's another problem when we just think in terms of raw numbers and assume that we can map that into the actual outcomes. So you got to think about capacity. You can look at stuff like capacity utilization rates and say, well, here in the US, we're only running our factories at about 77% of their full capacity. Okay, that's an aggregate number, right? That's an aggregate measure. You're going to need to get more granular, is the point that I'm making when you do this sort of thing. Once you get a sense of the people and the skills and the machines, how quickly, if you were to place an order with a major company for solar panels, wind, transmission, upgrading the grid, whatever, once you figure out what you want to do, and you find out if you've got companies who can fill orders, can you produce the things we need? If you're still short, then you have to start thinking about what can you do to free up capacity. Maybe you've got capacity in the economy, you certainly will, but it's being used for other purposes. Look, in the war effort, it didn't matter that Ford wanted to make automobiles. It mattered that the government wanted Ford to make tanks. And so depending on how determined you are to get where you're going in a time period that you've specified, you may be willing to actually look for ways to free up additional capacity. Here in the US, one thing the MMT community, scholarly community, has pointed to over and over again is healthcare, because we do have the most expensive healthcare delivery system in the world. Our outcomes are nowhere near the very best, but we spend by far and away more on healthcare than any other major country in the world. So an easy place to think about looking to free up resources is healthcare. If we spend about 20% of GDP in one way or another is healthcare spending. If we could get healthcare delivered more efficiently and get that number down to even 17%, we could provide better care by spending less, but it would also mean eliminating intermediaries, the middlemen. What I'm saying is it would cause some unemployment, and unemployment is freeing up resources. Now those people are available to be reemployed in other ways. So that's a way to free up capacity, to shift resources from their current use into some other use. You can look at Wall Street, you could look at the military, you could look at the number of people we incarcerate in this country, all sorts of things. I mean, politicians have proposed things like, allowing nonviolent offenders to be released, or spending less on the military. There's just all sorts of ways to free up real resources, okay? And Randy and Yeva wrote about all of those in their Levy report on a Green New Deal, so you can find that if you're interested. Okay, you can also, so you can check what capacity you have available. If you don't have everything you need, you can look for ways to shift resources, and beyond that, you can try building new capacity. And we did some of that in the US. We had, you may have heard, a number of bills that were passed when Joe Biden was president. We had an infrastructure bill that passed with bipartisan support, something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed with Democrats only. That was the most ambitious climate legislation we've ever had. It isn't the kind of climate legislation that many progressives would have liked to have seen, more state directed. It was much more designed so that you were putting incentives in place, subsidies and tax breaks and the like, to try to get consumers and businesses to behave in certain ways, to make investments in green manufacturing or to install solar panels or heat pumps or whatever. So you only move at the speed at which the private sector is taking advantage of those incentives, as opposed to less of a carrot and more of a stick approach. But in any event, it was the most ambitious climate legislation that we've ever had, and it does help build capacity. We had actually ignited something of a manufacturing boom as a result of that legislation. And then we had the Chips and Science Act, which is, mostly about semiconductors and building capacity to produce, to build fabs to produce semiconductors, little chips. So all of that was about building capacity, all right? So again, I don't love the imagery here, but it sort of does the job. This was, I think, produced by, I did an interview, I think it was NPR, but it might have been Marketplace, well, whatever it was. I think it was an NPR thing. And they sort of drew this up after an interview and said, well, I think MMT is trying to tell us that if we have lots of idle resources, slack in the economy, these guys on the left and gals who are sitting around not doing anything, that there is space, that represents real fiscal space, that the government could come in, hire those people, they could go to work helping to build this care economy that we were talking about earlier. But beyond some point, you got everybody working and you start to run out of fiscal space. And I'm not talking about money, right? I'm not talking about where the budget is or where the deficit is. I'm talking about real fiscal space, right? The real resources. When they're fully employed, then in a sense, you've hit a real limit, okay? So back to my good friend, John Maynard Keynes. Anything we can actually do, Keynes said, we can afford. In the long run, almost anything is possible. We can do almost anything we like given time. In good time, we can do it all, but we must work toward a long-term program. Anything we can actually do, we can afford. If we've got the technological know-how, and we've got the will, the political will, the commitment, and the resolve to act. We've got the resources to do it. Money is no object. That's what Keynes was telling us. This is a Levy report that I co-authored. A lot of this stuff we go through here in the form of a federal job guarantee. What could the world look like if we just let everybody with a desire to pitch in, who wants something to do, a way to contribute, work? If we let everybody in, what could we do together? All right, I'm stopping, and I hope I'll be able to see you, because I couldn't see you through any of that.
Okay, would anyone in the audience like to ask Stephanie or Stephen a question? So obviously this is like in the US context, but we can get to the
That's
UK
much
context as
better.
well. And later we'll have the political situation in the UK and how that kind of falls into. Oh, we've got a question back there.
Me that those with power and money wanted to win the war in 1939 to 45 or 41 to 45 in the US. So yes, money was no object then, but that's, to me, the big problem now is not the technicalities about money creation, it's not the economics, it's the power and the wealth that those who control the economy do not want to take these steps.
Well, that's
How
why
do we
I
break
agree.
through that?
We can't hear Stephanie now. Sorry, Stephanie, 1 second. Try talking, Stephanie.
I said I agree. Can you hear me? Okay. So sure, of course, we are not aligned around the mission. That's why I started in the early part of the presentation. I started with that, right? Where I said AOC understood what she would be and they would be up against. Powerful networks, ideologues, billionaires, I mean, who are aligned in opposition to a collective action response to climate. No question. I don't mean at all to gloss over that. In fact, that's why I put it up front so prominently. Yeah.
If I could just add, Stephanie was advising, we've lost her off the screen again. I could see her on the, all right. Stephanie, as we said, was advisor to Bernie Sanders in his presidential campaigns. He nearly won. We don't always have to lose. We think we always have. I mean, I sometimes think us on the progressive left, we're obsessed with losing. We've been losing for my entire adult life. But that doesn't, history, sadly, in many ways, is sort of moving in our favor. We don't have to lose with with people like yourselves and all the people that you're going to talk to and that you talk to already in your communities, in your political parties, if you're in a political party, and with leaders like Zach and maybe Zara and Jeremy Corbyn again. There is no reason why we can't win. I think the next general election in this country is going to be a 4 or 5-way tie. And I think a very small shift towards the progressive left in the UK could potentially have a very big impact on politics in this country. And I think it's possible to have the kind of political leadership in this country which might allow the kind of things that Stephanie was talking about actually to happen. And in fact, if I didn't think that was true, then we wouldn't be doing Modern Money Lab and we wouldn't be having events like this. And I would like to be positive and optimistic.
All right.
Can I say something real quick? I want to be optimistic
Hello?
too, but I also want to
thank
make
you for both
sure
of the
that
Sorry, one
talks.
second. Sorry. Stephanie was talking. Can we get Stephanie back? Stephanie, keep talking.
sorry, I didn't realize that we needed a toggle switch for the audio. No, I want to be optimistic too, and I applaud Stephen. And I wouldn't be doing the work that I do if I didn't think that change was possible. I just think it's really important to recognize that part of the reason, and he says part of the reason we or they or whatever lose is because of the way that they allow the debate to be framed by the opposition and then try to defend their policy proposals within the conventional frame. And I'm telling you, I have watched it inside and I have watched it outside. I have watched candidates place themselves on their own guitar to play by the opponents. Why do you think they frame arguments that way? Why do you think they lay the foundation for and press you to show your work and how you're going to get revenue from every one of these sources and how it will all map into the spending you're proposed? The reason they do it is to tie you up, because that's how they beat you. So I won't name names. You're probably aware, there are some candidates over here right now doing politics a different way. They're visionaries and they will tell you what they're fighting for and who they're fighting for, but they're not getting bogged down in the finer details because they understand that the entire debate will then become about the finer details. And that's how they will ultimately get beaten. And so, I put up the slide with Larry Summers, one of the most prominent voices within the Democratic Party. So Stephen wants to talk about the race there and how close someone like Senator Sanders came. But part of the reason that it didn't happen were too many people within the Democratic Party who didn't want to see it happen. And it happened with Joe Biden too. He wanted a Build Back Better agenda that included all sorts of expansions of the social safety net. And once again, it was people like Larry Summers, and most importantly, including Larry Summers, who led the charge against some of the Biden initiatives that then went on to undermine support. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we'll cut over to the next question in the room. Stephanie, can you hear us?
Okay, I was going to ask about central banks. Keynes's and Roosevelt's life was made easier because they brought the central bank to heel. To what extent is that part of Stephanie and Stephen's proposals?
Who would like to?
Well, you're right. During and immediately after World War II, the Federal Reserve, I know what we did best, so I'll speak to that. The Fed coordinated to maintain very low interest rates, in part because it understood that keeping interest rates low would keep government outlays low on interest expense, which would then also help manage inflationary pressures. And so when you have a central bank working hand in glove in that way with Treasury, that prevents the central bank from trying to exercise a veto, right? Veto power over democratically elected initiatives. So I gave a talk in Leeds, was that earlier this year? I feel like it was, where Stephen saying yes, where this is what I did. I talked about decisions that, practices that we currently engage in, the issuance of government securities and central banks using interest rates to try to manage inflationary pressures. I'm prepared to throw all of that out, right? We can rewrite the way that we do everything. When I said change the way we think about everything, add this to the list. Central banks, monetary policy.
Absolutely. So I've got another follow-up there, and another question there in the middle.
Hi, Stephanie. Brett Walsh here. Thank you ever so much for that talk. Very helpful. Been following MMT for a number of years now, I think since 2011. Going back to why I think progressives are losing the argument every time is because they've fallen into a couple of traps. One is they've seemingly, and hopefully this changes, but given up the fight for full employment. That is perfectly tenable. Obviously in neoclassical theory, we intentionally create a pool of unemployment, which is not that widely known to the public. But so there's that pitfall number one, that we can't do anything in terms of getting us back to full employment when we know in the reality of the monetary system and understanding the national accounts, that's not the case. So what has been the replacement? And this has obviously been in the realms of universal basic income. And what I've been trying to do over the years is get people to think like an MMTer. And the problem with UBI is if we are giving people that are not working a basic income, we are relying on the workers to keep producing the output. So politically, we're boxing ourselves in right away because we're surrendering the fight for full employment. And to working people, and this is coming from someone who comes from a working class background, jobs matter greatly to people like us. It's the bedrock, it gives us purpose. And it's about high time that we took the fight for restoring full employment. In the same way, the Labour government of Clement Attlee in 1945, through William Beveridge, brought the UK to full employment for the first time. And that doesn't necessarily mean to say that's 0% in terms of unemployment. It just means tight labour markets should be celebrated. Just really interested to see what your perspective is on that, because UBI, I think, is a thorn in the side of progressives.
Yes.
Yep.
That's great.
Good answer.
Sometimes you just don't try to top anything. It's all over. I mean, the only piece that wasn't there, and you know, it is foundational to MMT, is obviously that to make the point that the way that central banks try to manage inflationary pressures in the modern era is by dialing unemployment up and down, right? And what we're saying with the federal job guarantee, which is what he was describing, and the relative benefits, that a big benefit is that it is extremely destructive and costly to do it the way we do it now, and that the alternative would be to have an employed pool of people. And we, you know, have worked for many decades to try to show why it would be actually a better anti-inflation program to use full employment, true full employment, to counter inflationary pressures. So I think it's worth saying, but I appreciate that he led with the human and social benefits of full employment.
Question all the way at the back on the left side. Making you earn your dinner, Kieran. Thanks for running around.
Thank you. This is Tony Weston. I want to talk about bond vigilantes. Now, a few years ago, we had Liz Truss as Prime Minister. She announced a load of tax cuts for the rich, and she didn't give any way that these tax cuts were going to be funded. A few days later, the bond market crashed, and the Bank of England had to step in to support the bond market and support the pension funds. Now, I've been following MMT for a long while. I know that this event is being thrown back in our faces. So my question to you is, how can we argue against what happened in a credible way without... Yeah, that's it, really.
I'm going to shock you now. Are you standing or sitting?
He's sitting. He is sitting down. He's sitting.
So I think I heard all of that clearly, but before I begin my shocking reply, I want to make sure that I gather the central question is, given what happened to Liz Truss, how do you folks, progressives and the like, how do you respond to someone who says, but look what happened to Liz Truss? Is that right?
Yes.
Tell them. I want to be a little bit careful because I want you to understand that I'm also being playful-ish. Liz Truss was right. All right, here's how she was right, though. You got to get this part right. Because, she came, I don't know whether she was here in person recently or whether she recorded this interview from the UK. But she appeared on a very popular podcast that we have over here called Odd Lots. It's Bloomberg podcast. I don't know how many of you are aware or listen to it, but she was a guest recently. And she blamed the Bank of England for essentially the fallout in financial markets. She's not wrong. She's not wrong. She's also not wrong, I believe, to say that the central bank, we have this reverence. There's this reverence for the independence of the central bank. Oh, one must not, dare utter stories about, like I did, where you remind people that once upon a time, the central bank just said, we're not going to let interest rates go up. We'll manage that, and that'll be our role, because that compromised the independence of the Fed, and you're not supposed to do that. But she's not bothered by that. And she said, look, I got elected. I had an economic program. I ran on an economic program. Who are these unelected technocrats over here to come in and veto my economic and policy agenda? Why should they get to do that in a democracy? What is democratic about that? I think that's a question, that's a conversation worth opening up, where she was wrong and why, markets were able to do what they did. And there's a more complicated story, but I'm going to make it a little simple, is because she didn't have the support of her backbenchers. Her party is fractured. They smelled blood in the water, right? The guys that sit in front of computer screens and make bets about what's going to happen. She announced what was almost certainly an inflationary program in an environment of already very high inflation. So what do investors do? They sniff out risk and vulnerability. And they said, this lady's vulnerable. She doesn't have, they're not unified. The party isn't unified around this. The bank isn't going to step in. Her program is inflationary. They start repricing the likelihood of rate hikes down the road in response to some added inflationary pressure. And sure, the currency weakens and bond markets sell off. And then you had the little glitch with the pensions. It could have been addressed in very short order, and you could have responded in a much more timely way and avoided a lot of that havoc. But the bank wanted to let her cook a little, basically. And that's what happened.
Yeah, and so I think the really key thing to pull out of that is we need a unified government that is going to implement these things that we want to implement. Because if they had that, they could have pushed back against the Bank of England. Okay, great. Are there any questions from online, Gabby? Yeah, you need the microphone. Let me just give it to you.
Okay, Shaheen's asked on the YouTube live chat. In one slide, Professor Kelton pointed out the reduction of the allocated healthcare budget to make room for other spending. Doesn't this perspective represent a monetary fiscal view of inflation?
Well, no, because if I understand the question, it's about the Medicare for All and how we could free up resources. That's what he's referring to, or she?
Yes.
Yeah. So if we were to transition from bloated, inefficient healthcare delivery system that we have today to a leaner, more efficient, more comprehensive, right? Cover more people, do it in a more efficient way. We're talking about, as I mentioned, cutting out the middleman largely, right? The people who intermediate between patients and their healthcare providers. So all the private health insurance companies, they don't all go away, but a lot of it goes away, and the jobs that are tied to those jobs. So this is either a highly disinflationary or even potentially a deflationary policy to move to Medicare for all. So you're freeing up buildings and capacity and equipment and human beings, right? That's why I described it the way I did, as a policy change that would give you more fiscal space to work with. Real, right? Real fiscal space.
Great, thanks. Are there any more online questions, Gabby? Not for the moment. Feel free to put your hand up if you see any more. Yeah, in the middle here. Oh, sorry. Okay, there's one at the back and then in the middle here.
Hi. It's good to hear Keynes what he did, but it seems to me that the US came into the Second World War in December 1941, and Britain had been fighting it for 2 years. I think maybe losing half their Pacific fleet at Pearl Harbor would have meant that the Americans would have financed that war, whether Keynes had written that paper or not. So I'm thinking with climate change that nothing will happen until something big happens.
Well, I think about this. I mean, how much bigger? Sometimes, you know, Naomi Klein had her book, 3 years ago or something, On Fire. I mean, I was flying into Australia to be with Stephen and Gabby, and I was in the air looking at my iPad, and I can remember just the tears because so much of Australia was on fire as I was flying in, and I was seeing the images. And then you just, you know, just roll back in your mind. It's mudslides and floods and fires, and droughts and hurricanes and the trauma and the loss of life and property. And it gets to a certain point hard for me to wrap my head around the question, well, at some point, something really bad's going to happen and we're all going to wake up. I mean, it's the accumulation of global events that I don't have the capacity to understand the inaction. I don't accept that I understand the profit motive and capitalism and the power and vested interests in keeping the fossil fuels flowing and burning, and that's just where I think we are.
Okay, so we've got lots of hands now. So in the middle, yeah.
Sour note, please let there be.
Hi,
a happy
Stephanie.
ending.
Thanks for your time tonight. We know that climate change is the biggest issue this century, arguably, and it requires a big shift in how we produce things around the world, particularly in the global south. But how can an MMT framework frame the shift in approach to countries with weak currencies that rely heavily on imports, away from what was the Washington consensus in recent decades? It requires quite a fundamental shift, I believe.
I'm going to need a little help right there at the end. I didn't catch all of that.
Just in terms of shifting away from the Washington consensus on countries that have less monetary sovereignty and what can be done to help them to adopt an MMT lens. Is that a fair summary? Great.
Oh, okay. So Stephen can take you through an entire afternoon once we finish here, but I would be remiss if I didn't start by referencing the work of my colleague Fadl Kaboub on this point, because he has been working for a number of years now, I think increasingly closely with leaders, governments in the global South. He has laid out, I think, in reports and writing and speeches, just a multi-pronged approach to help countries, he would say, move along the spectrum in the direction of greater sovereignty with respect not just to energy, but food and medicines and technologies, those core needs that every nation, every society should be striving to secure independent capacities to protect the people, right? To shore up and provide security around the delivery of all of those things. There are certainly things that the international community could and should be doing to help advance, and it doesn't come in the form of charity, and it doesn't come in the form of debt and all of those things. We should be working together to strengthen the productive capacities within these nations, and Fadl has done, I think, a really outstanding job working to advance that mission.
Yeah, he certainly has. Fadl talks a lot about the development of food sovereignty and energy sovereignty, and also about the need for climate and colonial reparations. But he has come to learn that the only way to bring that about is for countries in the global South to exercise their collective bargaining power. You in the UK, and in fact across Europe, you lack the real natural resources necessary to power computers and to install solar panels and to do everything that you need to do to build the infrastructure of a post-growth economy, because those resources, many of them come from Africa. So countries in the global South are not poverty-stricken countries with no bargaining power. They have been trapped because the West 45 years ago chose to make use in the debt crisis of the early 1980s of their power as creditors to reimpose colonialism, to move to a neo-colonial trade and investment system, and to impose global economic relations where we still extract resources from them on an unfair basis, the way we did when they were colonies. That is something that needs to change. But until it does change, that doesn't mean the countries are powerless. They do have resources that they can use. Often they have a young and potentially productive population, which is available to make investments towards enhancing monetary sovereignty over time. And I strongly recommend you follow the work of Fadl and Ndongo Sylla. Also, is a Senegalese MMT economist. But Fadl, along with Stephanie, from my point of view, these days are the two most important MMT-informed economists in the world. So if you're not familiar with Fadl Kabout's work, there are many interviews with him online, which I recommend you get into.
Great question. I'm really loving all the questions from the men. If you're not a man as well, please do put your hand up and I will guarantee to call on you. Anyone else? Any? Brilliant. Oh, yes, back there on the left. I was going to call on a woman next. Sorry, I'll come to you next. Chair's right, sorry.
Hi, I'm a Leaf, so this is my first exposure to MMT. I was wondering, how do you avoid inflation? Like, how, if we do go this way, and that's what I'm in sort of politics, so they would say the things that you were saying earlier, they would level that accusation. This will lead to inflation.
Yep, great question. Stephanie.
It is the central challenge. And look, let's start with what we do today, because what I'm proposing can't be worse than what we do today. Okay, what we do today is, as I understand it, both in your country and in mine, lawmakers think about something that they want to do, something on the tax side, something on the spend side. And then some independent third-party agency, for us, the Congressional Budget Office, for you, Institute for Fiscal Study, whatever, somebody looks at this and goes, this is very good, what you've done. This is very good work. You've stitched the numbers together beautifully. We don't see any budgetary impact from what it is you want to do. Everything is paid for. And so we give it our seal of approval and pat you on the back and tell you to run along and spend all the money or cut all the tax, whatever you want to do. This is madness, okay? Because no one is evaluating these proposed changes on the tax or spending side for inflation risk, just completely ignoring it. They're, maybe completely is a bit strong, but not entirely. They're so focused on the budgetary impact. And if you neutralize any impact on the deficit, they just assume that somehow it will be inflation neutral. And what I'm suggesting is a wholesale revision of the way that we approach the federal budgeting process, so that people who make these decisions, lawmakers, are held to a higher standard to show their work when they are proposing to do big tax cuts or big spending program, to demonstrate that they have rigorously evaluated any potential inflation risk from what it is that they want to do. Can they show us that they have done a proper assessment of real resource availability? What are going to be the impacts, right? What's it going to take? How much pressure are you going to put on the real productive capacity of the economy? How can you anticipate inflation risk in response to what it is you're proposing to do? I don't want to stand here and tell you that anybody can see the future and that all of the moving parts in a multi-trillion-dollar complex economy where you have large corporations with pricing power who can do their own thing, that you can manage inflation risk such that it will be de minimis always. I can't promise that. I would never promise that. But what I can say is that the best way to try to avoid causing an inflation problem is to fight inflation ahead of time, ex ante, by the rigorous vetting of the proposed spending tax policy. Economists know how to do this. We used to be good at it. We used to rely on things like input-output modeling. We don't do that kind of work anymore. We take the difference between actual and potential GDP, which we just sort of imagine, and then infer something about inflation. We're just not, we aren't doing it in the sophisticated way that we need to be doing it. And then we need a whole new suite of tools to respond to inflationary pressure in real time if it does end up that inflation picks up to some level above which you don't want to tolerate it. Then you need a suite of tools, and relying on central banks to jack up interest rates and exacerbate a cost of living crisis and throw people out of work is not the way to go.
And if I could just add, while Joe Biden was president in the US obviously didn't seek to rapidly move towards a balanced budget or a budget surplus following the pandemic. They had those, as Stephanie was saying, ambitious investments. Now, in Australia, it was very different. We did very much try to run a budget surplus, or our government attempted to do so. And indeed, we have had some periods of budget surplus since the pandemic. Inflation didn't fall any quicker in Australia than in the US. And the UK was somewhere between the two. You didn't get a more rapid reduction You had much lower budget deficit, but you didn't have a lower rate of inflation than the US did. So the drivers of inflation, which were touched on in the movie, are very different to what people generally imagine them to be. And even if we talk about central banks as well, there is actually no persuasive evidence of any stable, reliable, predictable link from changes in interest rates to total spending in the economy, and no evidence at all of a stable, reliable link between interest rates and inflation. And if I was to pick on the UK, for most of the decade prior to the pandemic, you had inflation below target in the UK and unnecessarily high unemployment, and interest rates cut. When the Bank of England was basically trying to create inflation as hard as they could, they weren't able to create any. Central banks don't have an effective mechanism for managing inflation, and economists like Stephanie and Isabella Weber as well, that some of you will have heard of, are talking about inflation management as being a whole of government a problem in the future. And as it says in the movie, identifying what are the present and potential future contributors to inflation risk and taking that into account in the budgeting process. I could say a few more things about Liz Truss and bonds as well, but I won't.